Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for the reply. I don't always get one. That's nice. Welcome to the Phillips collection. I'm delighted you're here. I'm delighted to be here. 3 months into the gig, I still can't believe it. So I'm especially delighted to be here. My name is Jonathan Binstock. I'm the Vredenberg Director and CEO. And this is a terrific afternoon to be visiting the Phillips. We have a very special event. As you all know, we have with us today Christopher Rothko and Kate Rothko Prizel, the son and daughter of the pioneering artist Mark Rothko, who will be in conversation with our own chief curator, Elsa Smithgall, on the subject of their new book on Mark Rothko. That's all right. We've all been there. The Phillips has a very special relationship with Mark Rothko. If you're familiar with the Phillips, you probably are aware that we have a Rothko room, which is the first room of its kind, and in my humble opinion, the best room of its kind. I was confirmed earlier at brunch. I felt confirmed when I think it was Christopher who said, "Well, there's certainly nothing that surpasses it." But it's a very special room for not only because of how it represents the vision and the voice and the aesthetic of the artist Mark Rothko. It is a place, of course, where you, as the visitor, as the guest, can commune with everything that the artist, with a lot of what the artist hoped to achieve. But it has double importance for us at the Phillips Collection because it is a place where the power of the intimacy that the Phillips Collection is all about shines. Intimacy is a very important aspect of the work and the aesthetic and the sensibility of the art of Mark Rothko. Intimacy is a very important aspect of the experience of art here at the Phillips Collection. So the two come together in a kind of symbiotic relationship in such a way that the Rothko room represents the essence of what the Phillips Collection is all about. For a museum that's dedicated to always changing and mixing it up and rearranging the installations, it's the one room, well, one of two rooms. There's the Wolfgang Leib wax room, but of course the first room where that doesn't change. That is always here. Although it will change a little bit, right? It will change a little bit because we're going to lend 3 of those paintings to an exhibition that Christopher is curating for the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris, the largest exhibition to date of the art of Mark Rothko. So we're going to borrow 3 paintings, 3 new, different Rothko paintings, to take the place of 3 paintings that we're lending. So we'll have a whole new experience of that room, and we'll get to experience 3 new Rothko paintings for us here at the Phillips when the time comes. You'll learn more about that, I imagine, or you might hear more about that later. I'm not going to say too much more. I'm very proud of the fact that the artist Mark Rothko collaborated with Duncan Phillips on this room, on the scale of the room and the proportions of the room and the lighting of the room, all of which were arrived at with great care and specificity. And I'm very proud of the fact that the Phillips can play a role, and now I can help as well steward the legacy of one of the most important painters of the 20th century, without question. So with that, we have now a special occasion for you to reconnect with the long and cherished history between the Phillips and Mark Rothko in this event and with our special guest. So thank you for coming. Thank you to Christopher and Kate for coming, and I'm going to pass the mic to our chief curator, Elsa Smithgall.
Thank you, Jonathan. I just want to echo Jonathan in adding a warm, warm welcome to our wonderful audience. Thank you so much for being with us on this beautiful day, I realize. And a special thanks to Kate and Christopher for being with us and sharing their deep insights into the work of their father, Mark Rothko. I want to give you a little sense of our format today. I'm going to have some questions, and we'll have a nice conversation up here for a portion of the time. But do know that we will be opening it up to some questions from the audience. So keep those in mind over the course of our conversation. And at the very conclusion of our conversation here in the auditorium, we're delighted to be able to have a book signing. You can get your personal copy signed of the latest book on Rothko, and we do have them available for purchase as well, and that will be just outside the auditorium here. So with that, I would like to first start by giving you a little bit of a brief introduction of Christopher and Kate, and then we'll dive in. Kate. Kate Rothko Prizel is the first of Mark and Mary Alice Rothko's two children. She's a retired physician, and she practiced clinical pathology and transfusion medicine, as well as teaching pathology here in the Baltimore, Washington area. As a college student, that's important, Kate successfully sued one of the most powerful New York art galleries to reclaim her father's paintings, which he had always wanted to be shared with the public after his death. She won the return of more than 650 of Rothko's paintings, and then subsequently with her work with the estate and the foundation, she ensured that they were given as gifts to more than a dozen museums. She became the administrator of Rothko's estate, and she was involved in reconstituting the Mark Rothko Foundation. In addition, she's been actively involved with maintaining her father's legacy through planning exhibitions, writing, overseeing the creation of the Mark Rothko Catalogue Raisonné. So a little bit about Kate. And now Christopher. Christopher is the second of Mark and Mary Alice Rothko's two children. He's a psychologist, writer, and for the last 30 years, he's joined his sister, Kate, in being a custodian of Rothko's legacy. He's editor of his father's book on philosophical writings, The Artist's Reality, and author of a collection of essays of his own, Mark Rothko, From the Inside Out. Dr. Rothko has helped prepare more than 24 Rothko exhibitions all around the world, and he's, as you've just heard, co-curator of the upcoming Rothko exhibition at the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris. Christopher Rothko is the past chair of the Rothko Chapel board, and he has guided the restoration of that chapel and its enhancement over many years. So thank you both again for joining us. We have So here you're seeing the cover of the new book on Rothko with a self-portrait. And by way of opening it up here today, I thought I would just ask you a little bit about what you might see as what this new book offers. There's a lot of literature on Rothko, but I know that there was something important behind this particular publication. So I wondered if you might just share a little insight on what this book contributes.
Want me to start? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to think it offers a lot of things. First of all, there have been many, many books on Rothko, but I think given the state of our world and the publishing industry, most of them are now out of print. So we actually felt it was really important to have a substantial Rothko volume where people can, first of all, see the work in depth, but also have some informative essays that would give them a sense of what is happening in the work. It's really the first time Kate and I have collaborated on a significant publication, and we wrote the 2 primary essays, but we also selected all the works together, and we're very conscious that we wanted to give the full spectrum of our father's work, but also get into details and works that people might not have seen, but that we, just from our experience, knew were true gems and really important to the output. So we have a little bit of an inside track that way because we've seen the vast majority of the works, particularly on canvas, of many works on paper too. This was the first time that we could really bring canvas and paper together in a volume of this expansiveness.
Yeah, and actually for me, this was my first venture in actually writing about my father. I've spoken about him more informally over the years. And I think there was a real reason for me to try to present a biographical piece which would more focus on my relationship with him from the 1950s onwards. So it was an opportunity for me, which I had not taken before, to put something down in writing. I also think the book is enhanced by a short piece by an art historian, Alexander Nemiroff, and also by a piece by Sugimoto, who is an artist who has a real connection with my father. I think he feels a connection. There has been a joint exhibition of the 2 artists, and I think that forms another important contribution to the book.
Well, as you've said, you have been living with, studying, and immersing yourself in your father's work for decades. So I thought it would be interesting to reflect for a moment on how your understanding has changed of his work over all this time. What might be a newer insight that you might have gained?
Well, for me, I think it was for quite a number of years hard to step back from my father's biography and reading into the increasingly dark colors of his work, a biographical message of his increasing depression over the last years of his life. So I think for me, I really needed some time to step back from that feeling and really examine his 1960s work from a different perspective, and particularly his late black and gray canvases. And I think over the years I have a completely different feeling about them that has nothing to do with his biography. I see it as really simply a new, perhaps more meditative direction he was taking with his work in the 60s. And I see that really culminating in some ways in the chapel in Houston. I never feel like I have enough time when I go down there to really just sit and spend time with the work, but that perhaps is the best statement of the meditative and spiritual quality of the later works. And then I see, perhaps one might have thought of the Rothko Chapel as, in the sense a culmination of his career, in the sense that the first space he was able to create for his works was at the Phillips Gallery, but I think an important step for him was then to create this spiritual space. But when I look back now, I realize that even after his completion of the murals for the chapel, he was really constantly looking in new directions. And I really see that in the late black and gray works now, and also interestingly in some of the late works on paper, which are not all of those somber hues.
And we'll take a look at that a little later. I have a few images, but let's go ahead and hear from Christopher if we could.
There would be a lot of answers to that question, but I'm going to actually talk a little bit about one of the nice things about being a Rothko is that we have exposure to a lot of works that people wouldn't normally see in a museum setting. Typically, the works like the one on the cover are what you see in a museum, but in fact, he painted for almost 30 years before he arrived at that format. And paintings like the painting on the left were typical, I was going to say typical of an earlier style where he painted figuratively for almost 20 years, but in fact, there's no real typical Rothko because he's a restless soul, and every painting is an experiment, and you see him trying different techniques. I mean, I'm just looking, there's something about the way this at least shows up on my screen. I'm really seeing the details, the striping in his coat. He's constantly looking for new ways to make color expressive, to use just little pieces of form to bring out different aspects of what's happening in the painting. And we see that develop and we'll see this, I'm sure that you're going to bring up images that are sort of the glue between this and the later work, but he's constantly experimenting. And even once he arrives at his classic format, every painting is an adventure. It's not like, okay, 3 rectangles, 2 rectangles, I know how to do that. It's like, okay, how am I going to maximize the expressiveness of this painting, and how is this going to be different from what I painted yesterday? And to see how that works itself through from the earliest stages has been constantly interesting for me.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue here because, as you anticipated, I thought I would share in this slide the course of Rothko's career work from the early figurative period, as you just heard Christopher refer to in the 30s, the folded hands, into the 40s with the Last Supper, and then arriving at the classic abstract works, for which he is most known. I think, just to your point, so often that's all we think about with Rothko, and there's often this sense that there is such a huge break between the early work and the late work. But in fact, I think it's interesting. I wondered if you wanted to think it through with us here and share a little bit. We've got 30 years of time here represented, more than 30 years. In what ways is there a thread here? Are there ways there's something connecting them, and there might be things that are, by contrast, different across this. So whichever route you guys want to take, but I think it's just to kind of get your reaction here to thinking about the arc of his career, early to late.
Why don't you start with that? I know you've written a lot, and particularly for this book, on that subject. So.
Well, one of the soapboxes I love to get on about our father's work is that people first word they think of when they think of Rothko is color. But I'm quite insistent that it's really not primarily about color, although color is certainly a really important expressive means for him. But from the very first moments of his career, he's really preoccupied with form and how the composition works and how it's laid out to maximize the communication with the viewer. And I think if we look at these 2 earliest examples, one from 32 and one from 41, these dates, of course, are approximate because he never dated anything unless he was selling it, and he didn't sell anything for a really long time. But you can see that the focus in this first portrait, full-length portrait, right, is a figurative painting, but she is very present there, but you're not really getting details of her face. You're not seeing a whole lot about her personality. She is really a figure very much defining the space, and what's in the background, what appear to be a lot of canvases. This is not atypical to see, if you will, things that create geometric spaces within the background of his paintings. He moves on to the first of a couple of neo-surrealist styles in this painting, The Last Supper. This is quite an early example of that. And there again, these are not so much figures. These are hardly the apostles, right? There's a suggestion of the apostles, but in fact, this is some sort of composition that is much about defining the space as it is about the people in it. I'll let you take it from there. I'll talk.
I would say, it's been interesting, actually, when I've, gone and read my brother's writing on the subject, that I really feel a resonance, which I would not have expected, because we didn't grow up together. We're 13 years apart in age. I was sort of off at college and things. But particularly when I read his essay about form, I was struck by it. And I always think of my father as a very considered, meditative painter. He didn't knock off a painting in a day or two. He took several weeks to complete a painting. Then he might set it aside and go back and study it, see if he was happy. Yes, one of the things he was concerned with was he happy with color relationships, and he often made some changes in the color. We can see that in multiple layers that were applied. Probably, a little bit later in the process, he would go back and change a color. But I think his main preoccupation was also with relationships between the forms and relationships between the rectangles and the edge of the canvas. And this was something he was extremely concerned with. And I remember going to his studio during the time he was creating the chapel murals and watching him agonize over those relationships and often change the relationship between the central form in the paintings from the chapel that have a central form and the border of the painting. So I would have to come back and say that the idea that form was extremely important to him was something that really resonates with me, particularly when I read Christopher's essay first.
And I'm going to advance through and share a few other earlier examples of this figurative period, and that sort of does coincide with some of what you've just shared, and thinking about at this stage the way that Rothko has a real keen eye for the architecture and sense of space and form, and then to really look at this interesting comparison. That's 15 years span of time between the portrait, as you see on the left, and the classic abstract composition on the right. So again, just thinking about the way that you might see how the work from the 30s could offer already some insight into what would be coming, and I think that that was an interesting comparison, I know, in your book, Christopher. So I wondered if you wanted to touch a little bit also on sort of some of the seeds of the portrait, the hallmarks that would then evolve, and how it prefigures the later work.
Yeah, and I will just add that it's actually a building behind him, and it comes off kind of orange, at least in the reproduction I can see. It's really pretty hot pink. So it's actually in reality, and the green of the dresser is greener than it appears here. So in fact, the parallel is closer than it appears here on screen. But I've always loved this painting. It's one of the last of his figurative paintings, or a group from right around this time. And in each of these, the figure in some ways almost disappears. So here, like, the face and head are painted in like a grisé. There's no color. You really can barely see the facial figures. And he's this very elongated figure that, again, marks a space, but is hardly a personal presence in the painting. And strangely, it's even the window curtains on either side of him, in some ways, have more personality than he does. And he's much more preoccupied with these. He brings them out via color. Of the space behind. The sky, the building, and the dresser become the most dominant parts of the composition. I don't think he has anything against this boy, but the boy is serving a function. And the boy is serving a function in the painting. The painting is not serving the boy. So.
Well, let's look again. Sort of as you can see, sort of trying to share some of the more unfamiliar sides of Rothko than what we often see. So we'll lead up to some of those glorious classic abstract works. Don't worry. But I think it's really quite fascinating. This moment, this real, again, a kind of interesting moment just after the purely figurative works, and just in anticipation of the what you call the mythological works. So these two works just really struck me, and I thought it would be interesting to hear sort of how you see these fitting into Rothko's aesthetic, and sort of what is he getting at with these particular works. Either or, if you want to comment. Not that there's a direct connection, but they happen to both be from around the same time period. So. Yeah,
I think you could still see the, interest in the architectural in both of these works. But what I've always found interesting, particularly with these two works, and there are certainly others from the period the same, is the claustrophobia you feel in these two particular works. The ceiling is literally on the figures' heads. And it's interesting because that's something in many ways in his later work I think he so broke away from. I feel that his, classic paintings, if anything, are expansive. It invites, the viewer both to take in the surface of the painting, but also, because the paintings are not framed, extend their vision beyond that. And to me, that's an interesting contrast, because this particular group of paintings, and there's a whole series, this one on, I guess you're right, or am I right too, is from what was sometimes called the Subway series. And yes, I can say I do find the New York subway a claustrophobic space, but it's interesting that this other painting, having nothing to do with the subway, has the same feeling of claustrophobia. So I find that interesting, because I don't find that particular aspect is something that carries into his later work.
I think that's fine.
Okay. Okay.
I'm assuming we have a lot of ground to cover.
Yes. All right. Well, this neo-surrealist work has a lot of special personal meaning. So I thought we could talk a little about the slow swirl at the edge of the sea. And Kate, I wondered if you wanted to take on talking a little bit about what makes this so special.
Well, this was, from a personal standpoint, this was actually the first work that that my mother saw my father paint when they met in late 1944 and married in fairly early in 1945, a very short courtship. What is also interesting about this particular painting is the scale of the painting. You see my father here on the left standing in front of an easel. And the size of that easel was probably appropriate for most of the paintings he was painting in the 1940s. But you can see he couldn't in any way accommodate the painting on that easel. So he's actually standing in front of this very large scale painting, which is otherwise quite typical of his work of the mid-1940s. So it's interesting that this particular work he took to that scale. We actually, in my father's perhaps somewhat later period, which is, I think, not very brilliantly being called his multiform period, but best name for it, the late 1940s. We have one work again, which is on this incredible scale. So it's interesting that he was, experimenting with scale at that point. But this painting was actually in an exhibit at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery and ended up being purchased out of that exhibit at the time, and subsequently was given to the San Francisco Museum. And I think my father was very happy about that placement at the time. He was actually teaching during the summers in San Francisco in the late 40s. But in the early 1960s, my mother really asked my father, could she bring this painting home, which meant so much to her. And indeed, he was able to bring about a trade of this, personally significant painting for a classic painting of his and get the painting home. So from the early 1960s, it always hung over our couch in the living room and was a wonderful addition.
And I'll just throw in that it does have a subtitle, which is really, I think, only known to the family, although we've suggested it to MoMA that they put it up there, which is Mel Ecstatic. Our mother was known as Mel, which is a strange contraction of Mary Alice. She just went by Mel almost her entire life. So yes, this was clearly inspired by her, and it is probably the two of them the two figures are probably the two of them in a beach scene.
And interestingly, there's been a lot of back and forth about which is the male and which is the female.
My sister and I rarely disagree, but I think we disagree. Although I don't know what my current position is, but it's certainly contrary to hers.
That's right. Whatever it is, we may.
Thank you. Great insight. See, if you go to MoMA, guys, you wouldn't know this. So, speaking of that you were talking about, that sort of the progression towards the multi-form and transitional works, I wanted to kind of look at the mauve intersection that you see here in relation to one of the early classic abstract works as a way of thinking about that moment and bridging. They're both from around that same period of time. And as a sidebar, the mauve intersection was a painting that Phillips owned at one time. It was actually one of the first works in the first group of 3 works that Duncan Phillips acquired. It was one of them, which unfortunately subsequently was sold in 1971. By Marjorie Phillips. It was never hung in the Rothko room, but it was a great work at that time and still is. So I thought it would be interesting, how do you see the bridge here between the mauve intersection and the untitled?
So between Slow Swirl at the Edge of the Sea and Mauve Intersection, there are 4 years of him moving into really pure abstraction. But the canvases are kind of amorphous. There are many, many patches of different colors. You're already seeing Rothko's color palette of the 1950s, for which he's famous and which is represented so beautifully in the Phillips Rothko room. And you can see that certainly in Mauve Intersection. But what happens is he keeps simplifying and simplifying, so that by the time you get to Mauve Intersection, you really have only a few semi-geometrical shapes that are going to pretty rapidly in the next couple months coalesce into what we think of as a Rothko. And this painting on the right, which is in I'm sorry, on the right. I keep thinking you can see the screen, but if I'm gesturing here, I'm really gesturing there. Which is in the Guggenheim's collection. This is right on the cusp of being a truly classic work. You see the typical, very saturated but pretty bright colors, sunny colors of the 1950s. And you have just a couple of additional elements like these little sidebars, but in fact, those pop up off and on throughout the early 50s. Again, people think he hits this formula, and that's what he does. If you flip through the catalog raisonné, which is the complete catalog of his works on canvas, and the works on paper are coming soon, stay tuned, you'll see that these pop up from time to time, including in a work that we're going to see a little later in my sister's collection. So you can see that he's simplifying, and he simplifies more. And in literally a couple months after the painting at the Guggenheim, it's going to be more typically a 2 or 3 rectangle format, but there are always little bits intervening. And he, as I said, he's restless. He's always experimenting. Notice I didn't talk about color too much.
So I know in the first or second question, this was brought up in your response to thinking about the importance of form for Rothko, and the fact that many have overemphasized color as the dominant aspect, and including Duncan Phillips. I know you cite in your book, Christopher, from Marjorie Phillips's anecdotes, a moment where she asked Rothko, am I right that color means more to you than any other element? To which he replied, no, measures. So anyway, we were often, as you said, fall into that tendency to want to emphasize color. But I thought it would be interesting looking at these works for you to talk, UMK, to talk a bit about the idea of form and how that really is, in fact, the dominant element, or the quiet dominant element.
Do you want to talk about this? I've talked about it a lot. I bet you can do it. I more than bet you can do it.
I'm sure I could do it, but I was very tempted to say something about color, but not in the vein that we
Please do.
think
Please
of.
do.
I mean, I'm actually fascinated in going back and reading some of my father's writing, which he mainly did in the 1940s. And what fascinates me most, one of the tendencies when one focuses on color, particularly with the works in the 50s, is to see these works as decorative. And one of the things that has really interested me looking back at his writing is his insistence that his subject matter, if you will, and he was always emphasizing that subject matter, even in his abstract works, was important, was tragedy. So I have to wonder whether we were really misinterpreting his use of these brighter colors over the years. And that's one thing I am now struck by looking at many of these bright works from the 1950s. But in terms of form, as you can see, even though the colors of these two works are very similar in many ways, the feeling of the paintings is entirely different. And much of that is due to the relation of the rectangles to each other, and also their relationship to the edge of the painting. So here on the left, you have a more complicated arrangement, obviously, with 3 rectangles. Christopher has written a great deal about the word stacked, and it is the world's worst description, but 3 rectangles, one above the other, we'll say. Superimposed, and with these very feathery edges, but yet some distance between the rectangles and the edge of the painting. In the painting on the right, you have a completely different format, somewhat less feathery edges, a different juxtaposition with the edge of the painting, and I have to say that the painting almost confronts you in a different way from the one on the left.
Yes, and I will throw in that scale is a part of that too. And I have to say, first of all, I have to say I'm incredibly grateful. Both of these works, which are both masterpieces, are going to be in Paris. But the one on the right, you can't tell here, but it is on an unprecedented scale for him. It's with two other paintings from that year, the largest paintings I believe he has painted, save for two yellow paintings that are in one in Europe and one in Qatar. But and it's so he's not only confronting you with a different format in these two paintings, but also the scale is quite different, and it really the interaction with the viewer because of that is quite different. He's really occupying your whole field of vision.
We got to go to Paris, guys.
Absolutely.
See it. All right. So I thought we could touch on the commission that I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with, the Seagram Mural Commission for the New York's Four Seasons restaurant that Rothko pulls out of. So there's a lot of mythology around this commission, and many of you here remember the play Red, that arena stage that was a fictionalized version telling of the story. We did a stage reading here at the Phillips. Some of you also may be familiar with. So there's a connection here, even here at the Phillips with this. But I thought that if you really could strip away all that mythology and you guys could talk to us about the significance of these Seagram murals, the particularly special place that, the role they play within Rothko's of, how are they so significant for his later development in the 1960s?
Well, I guess I would speak of it from two different standpoints. First of all, I think with these murals, his focus on form actually becomes much clearer to the viewer. It's not just something that, a more seasoned viewer can sit back and analyze, but it's something which I think is very apparent to the viewer. But the other thing I would say, particularly about these murals, is it was really my father's first opportunity, although one that didn't come to fruition, to create a space for his paintings, and a situation in which the viewer would be surrounded by his work and be able to be immersed in the work in a different way. So had this come to fruition, I suppose that the Phillips Gallery would not have been that first space. And it has come, obviously, one that's very different in any way, but I think that my father attached great significance to the idea that he was creating a space for the viewer. Now, my father was also always extremely concerned with the sensitivity of the viewer. He didn't want his paintings to be presented, in a sense, to just any audience. He wanted an audience that he felt would truly understand what he was trying to achieve. And I think what was most disappointing to him about the project was that when he saw the actual setting in which the paintings were going to be seen, he knew that that audience was not going to be there. And thankfully, perhaps not the exact same grouping that was intended for the Four Seasons restaurant, but a very similar grouping wound up at the Tate Gallery. And although he never saw the final installation of those works, he was able to be involved in the concept for the space.
Yeah, so that was the first. I guess first he was able to design the room and the layout for that. He had also arranged the layout for their original home, which was going to be in a restaurant, in the Four Seasons restaurant in New York, which, as you referenced, I think he realized was not going to be also conducive to looking at his art. I think the other thing that happens with this commission, and he actually talks about this, at least obliquely in his writings, is this is the moment when he starts to turn down the brightness level on his color palette and goes to a typically darker, some people call it more somber. I would simply call it more saturated and more meditative kind of color palette. But I think he recognizes in this moment that in this public setting, in a restaurant, you're going to be sitting there for an extended period of time. He doesn't have to catch your attention walking by in a gallery. You're going to be sitting with these for a while. So he changes to a different tonality that's going to sort of more slowly seep into you. He's going to be very clear that he's getting away from anything that might be misconstrued as decorative, but he's some ways sacrificing the ability to grab the viewer in the same way that he had been able to, at least often, and instead he knows he's going to probably lose some people, but he's going to have longer conversations with whoever does choose to stop in front of his paintings.
Well, thinking about, as Kate mentioned, the fact that it didn't get realized means that the Phillips got to be the first museum with a dedicated space. It's a little different because it's not site-specific. These were individual paintings that were not made specifically for the Phillips, but that, again, were made with the understanding Duncan Phillips knew that Rothko wanted to let them be experienced in their own room. Mm-hmm. So I thought it would be nice to sort of reflect a little, you've been talking a lot about the way Rothko was so keen on creating a certain kind of experience for the viewer in the space. So talk to us a little bit about how you think that this room really might have provided a certain kind of experience that Rothko was after. Let me show you this closer up view.
I think the first word that comes to my mind when I think of the Phillips Rothko room is intimacy. Although these are relatively large works, the room is quite small. I don't know how many, I know you limit how many people are in at a time. I'm sure no matter how low it is, it's still probably too many, because really more than a few people in there, you're very conscious that you're sharing space, and these paintings really demand your attention. I think he was very conscious when he wanted to create a space. He really wanted to have a conversation with a solitary viewer, really have that back and forth, really have his painting sort of seep to your insides. And I think he recognized how fragile that kind of relationship could be. He didn't want any distractions. So he really creates a very small, quiet space. In some ways, I almost wonder if he was responding to the scale of the Phillips itself, which is a wonderfully intimate museum. It's not full of grand galleries, it's full of smaller rooms where you can really be up close with the works. And I think he loved that, and certainly Duncan Phillips loved that. So between the two of them, they were able to work out something that in some ways carries over the feeling of the museum into this beautiful room.
And I look back thinking of the idea of intimacy to his first retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. And, museums have changed so much over the decades. But I look back at that original iteration of MoMA and realize that it had, to some degree, the same kind of intimacy. The ceilings were not that high. In that exhibition, he was able to they created enough walls so you were actually perhaps surrounded on three sides by works and therefore allowed the viewer to have that kind of more intimate experience. What that exhibit, of course, did not allow was to really spend time in a room with the paintings, which is really unique to the Phillips collection.
So you heard Jonathan mention the exhibition coming up. It's coming up this fall, the Fondation Louis Vuitton, and you're recreating a room for our Rothkos. I thought if there's anything you might want to share as a little teaser of what we might be looking forward to, and within even the way that you're playing out the whole exhibition.
Well, the exhibition at the Fondation Louis Vuitton is the largest, or amongst the largest, Rothko exhibition ever put together. I didn't mean for that to happen, but it's very good fortune that it did, because it's a huge museum with a lot of large galleries. It's really kind of the anti-Phillips. This is a big public space, and they do big exhibitions there that have to be of maximum impact. So part of the challenge has been trying to translate these works that I'm used to trying to put into as small a place as possible, how to maximize what they have to say in a much larger space. The one exception to that is going to be one very small gallery where we will have 3 of these 4 magnificent paintings from the Phillips collection, and there will be, again, a limited entry. I can already see the line backed up to get into the Phillips room at this exhibition, but you will be able to have just a few people in there at a time having this much more intimate experience. I think we can probably, I think you'll agree with me that anytime you move these paintings to a different place, it'll be the same paintings arranged with the same proportions, and they're going to look different, and I'm excited to see how they look different in that space. I think it will be another chapter in the beautiful life of these paintings.
And we're looking forward to sort of a new look to a new experience in our existing Rothko room too. So I hope many of you will come back during that period to the Phillips and get to experience these beautiful Rothko paintings from the private collection of Christopher and Kate. So rarely seen, will be terrific. Well, 1960 is the year that the Phillips Rothko room is launched, and then we have 4 years later. The commission, this is not when it's actually going to open, but 4 years later, the commission for the Rothko Chapel from the de Menils, and it won't actually fully get realized until after Rothko's death in 1971, but he certainly will have spent a lot of time on this. So I thought it would be interesting. I know that in a way, the experience in this chapel is sort of beyond words. I know you can't really. So for those of you who haven't been, I hope you will go and experience it. But while we have Christopher and Kate here, I thought it would be interesting for you to also talk a little bit about this was so important in Rothko's life and the way that it was fulfilling a vision he had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think very much so, and I think I think probably his spirituality was something that was always there for him, not a formal connection with religion, but certainly always a spiritual connection. And I think, perhaps combined with this move to more meditative tones and things, this was really a driving force in his wanting to take on this commission. But we also talk about the importance of audience, and I always come back not to this, the audience, but he was very concerned with collectors who took an interest in his work and that they understood the work and what he was really intending. And I think one of the things that played a major role here was meeting the de Menils, who were really unique people. Again, from a totally different background. They were both Catholic, but they were very liberal Catholics. They were very interested in the newer Catholic theology of the 1960s. They were extremely open-minded. And I think that kind of approach really appealed to my father. So although he knew he was going to be creating what at the time was a Catholic chapel on the campus of a small Catholic university in Houston, Texas, he really was enthusiastic about undertaking the commission. And again, here he had the opportunity to be intimately involved with creation, not just of the works for the space, but of the configuration of the space itself. And that ended up being I think perhaps looking back to his question of structure, taking on a commission where he could also create the space in which the paintings were going to hang might extend that idea.
And I'll add only that the de Menils, who were already collecting his work and who knew our father pretty well, began with the idea of taking those Seagram murals, remember, that we saw installed in the Tate a few slides back, because they knew my father had been trying to find a home for those. Said this would be wonderful, we could use these in a chapel. And our father said, no, actually, I want to completely rethink this. If this is these were not painted for a spiritual space. If we're going to make a chapel, I want to make work that is specific for a chapel. So he's creating. We really think of this as a single artwork. These 14 panels, but the room is as much a part of that work. And as Kate referenced earlier, how much he was playing with the proportions of just the side bands of some of these paintings. Similarly, the proportions of each of the walls that they were going to sit on were as important to him as the proportions of the paintings themselves. It's really, each of those walls in work is one unit, and the whole room is ultimately one unit. And he wanted to have one, maximally impactful spiritual, philosophical conversation with the people who came.
I think the one other thing that's really interesting about the project is really the first time my father painted mainly using natural light, or knowing that his paintings would be seen mainly in natural light. And one of the issues that came up is natural light for him in the middle of Manhattan, Yes, he had a skylight in the ceiling, which may or may not have been too clean. The building was also surrounded by tall apartment buildings. And so natural light was relatively subdued. And one of the major problems the chapel has dealt with over the years, which has now been brilliantly solved with Christopher and the team he found, was dealing with controlling the light level in the chapel. But this is really almost a unique experience to see Rothko works almost entirely with natural light, which is I think was a big change for him, particularly. I mean, now we see it in museums all the time, but at the time it was a real departure for him.
So I wanted to come back to something again that you both were alluding to earlier in terms of the very latest works, the way that we tend to think arbitrarily that the chapel marked the culminating statement of Rothko's career, when in fact the last 2 years of his life were his most prolific ever, and that it was also marked by continued experimentation and variety. So I'm going to show you a few of these slides in sequence, but I thought, how are these late paintings a new beginning? That's my question. And so I have a couple where, again, we think that you see those really dark colors, that in fact, subsequent to that, you see these lighter pastel works, and that brilliant yellow, and then you see also the black and gray series. So those are a couple of the images from this latter period, and whichever ones you wanted to talk about, or all of the above, but I just thought, in a way, I think it's really important to stress and look at, as you have very much in your book, these brilliant late works that follow. So.
Yes, I mean, as Kate said earlier, we don't usually make a direct connection between his actual mood and the colors that he's painting in. And although I would say the majority of his works in those last 2 years are darker in tone, there are many brilliant exceptions to that. And throughout it, he is experimenting, first of all, with materials, a lot of works on paper and using new materials. Most of these are in acrylic, which is a new departure for him. And ranging in scale from very intimate, barely over a foot tall in many cases, to works on paper that were an unprecedented scale for him of around 6 feet tall. So he and as Kate also alluded to when we were talking about form, he's playing with form all the time. Yes, it's still quasi-rectangular, but particularly in these last works you were showing, the sort of more pastel works, and in the black and gray works, he's introducing a white border in many of these paintings, which had never existed before, and which actually very directly changes. It's a little hard to see on a white background, but particularly the work on the right, you can see there's a little white border that surrounds it. It completely changes your interaction with the space and the format of the painting, whereas before they seemed to expand, now they're actually contained a little more. So he thought about that a lot. The painting on the left actually had a border on it that he painted over. We think that's the first. So he's questioning all the time and changing his relationship with the viewer as he's doing that.
Yeah, and I think we actually have a couple of paintings which are without the white border, and it's fascinating to put them side by side and see the difference in the impact of the painting on the viewer. It's really fascinating. But, other thing I want to say is that to me, these paintings, although they're more confined, still seem to draw the viewer to something beyond the surface of the painting. Maybe not quite in the meditative, spiritual way that the works in the chapel do, but they're still, they're not putting the viewer off. They're really drawing them into something beyond. And I mean, something that also doesn't always show up in reproductions is there's a lot of subtlety in each of these two fields. Particularly it's seen in the painting, I guess on the right, in the lower gray field, where you can see all the paint strokes and things and the different tones coming through.
I think that before we open it up to questions, my final question really has to do with legacy, because I know that you are so thoughtfully working to steward your father's legacy. And we're in a very different age, today, in the 21st century. I mean, we talk about installation art today and immersion and things like that, and they certainly may have a little bit different connotation. But at the same time, I guess my question has to do with, how do you hope that Rothko's works speak to us today? What makes the idea of the tragic and the timeless in his work that, still very much with us in this moment?
Yeah, I think maybe one thing that helps bridge the now 50 plus years since our father's death is that he was never painting for his moment, although he is on record saying art is necessarily of its time. You can't, even if you're fighting against it, you're still reacting to your times. But his focus was never on doing the now. His focus was always on doing the forever. So he was trying to, throughout his career, develop an art, a painterly language, if you will, that would be as universal as possible, that would speak to as many people as possible. That's why he also settled on abstraction as a language that he thought was as unspecific in terms of addressing a particular type of viewer as possible. It may not be for everyone, but we certainly meet people constantly who continually find the work very moving. Could have been painted yesterday.
Yeah. And I'm always actually struck with how many young people are at, various exhibits I go to. I mean, I think I was first struck. We have some wonderful installation photographs from my father's exhibit from the MoMA retrospective, traveled to the Whitechapel Gallery in London. And we just have these amazing photos, installation shots with the audience, if you will, and there are an amazing number of young people who are struck, and I still see that when I go and look at lines at various retrospective exhibits. And I guess it's interesting because my father was so concerned about his audience that you might think in some way he was intent on limiting that audience. But I think, maybe speaking for myself, to some degree for Christopher, I've been more interested in broadening that audience over the years. One of the things that has pleased me a lot is that the National Gallery sees as part of its mission, and they have a large proportion of the paintings that were in the estate, to send those paintings to smaller communities around the country. And I actually see a great positive in that, extending the audience, interesting a broader audience. So maybe we're not exactly following my father's concerns, but I see it as an important direction to be taking things.
Well, let's give a big round of applause for Christopher and Kate. What a treat, truly. I'm sure it's been as enriching to you. So I'd love to invite anyone from the audience who'd care to make a comment or question. There's a person with a mic here. If you would just bear with us a minute, and please feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I actually feel like this question kind of relates exactly to what we were just saying. So I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm a Gen Z member, and I was thinking about, whether you were open to, I guess, technological displays of your father's work. And, I'm thinking back at Harvard, a couple years ago, some of the damaged murals were presented using computer-generated, I forget exactly the techniques, but they were able to go back into public display for the first time in a long time. So, these technologies only going to get more and more pronounced every single year, let alone decades. So, I'd be curious to hear maybe perhaps a little bit about what you guys thought about that installation back at in Cambridge, and also just about the broader mores of technological advancement together.
Sure. We worked actually pretty actively with the conservators and curators at Harvard for that exhibition. We've long felt, back to Kate's discussion about how those murals for the Seagram, which the Harvard murals are relatively similar to that, how they're as much about the architecture as they are about the color. So we've actually long felt that those works have remained viable even in their discolored states. But what the curators pointed out to us is that they had faded in differential ways. The 5 panels, one of them was barely faded, one of them somewhat faded, the other 3 completely faded, and that they were no longer a unit. And so what they were doing by doing this color correction, so just to let the full audience know, anybody who didn't see this show, is that they actually took digital projectors and had literally bitmapped pixel by pixel, I mean these enormous canvases, and projected a corrective color onto the canvases so they were perceived as pretty darn close to their original color. But what this allowed them to do is function as a unit again, function as a room, whereas before they were 5 canvases that didn't necessarily speak to each other anymore. And I thought it was quite powerful. And the great thing is that you haven't touched the surface of the work. So the surface is there intact, and nobody's restored this. You can turn the light off if you think it's a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, I was very excited about the installation, and totally in a positive fashion, but I have to say that it did raise a fair amount of controversy about what is a painting, what is a virtual image, a controversy which I didn't totally buy into, but one that I'm sure will perpetuate itself and remain an issue about what is the real picture? Is this an image of a picture? Is it the painting itself? And I think somewhat to my distress during the exhibition, and I don't know if you actually attended the exhibition, so many people were going up to the picture and deliberately standing in the light beam to see what it would do, So there was the idea that this was an experiment. Rather than a display of the works. And I guess what I worry about going into the future, if that were to be used again, that people cannot get away from the fact that that technology is being used, and that takes away from the power of the pictures, which I think is a shame. And I have to say, I'm too much of a Luddite to know too much more what's going on in technology other than, people trying to sell reproduction or virtual images on the internet, which I have a great deal of trouble understanding the value of, but I feel I'm of another generation and, can't really speak to it anymore.
Another hand, there we go.
Thank you for being here. I wanted your thoughts on why you think the media grew so obsessed with the forgeries that came up over the last decade, and what do you think that says about either the time, the media, or your father's works?
Well, I don't think this is true globally about the media, but I think, the public first wants to hear about intrigue, and they want to hear about money. And these got sold for a lot of money. And, let's face it, half the things on TV are cop shows, right? They're tracking down the bad guys. The idea that somebody, even sophisticated art lovers, can be duped. There are many layers of sort of human drama in that. So I think ultimately that was what was being sold, if you will, through these through all the media coverage. And it's a little bit shocking. This was it was the oldest existing gallery in New York City, over 100 years old, engaging in this. So that's another story in and of itself.
I don't think I really have any.
Another question?
Yes, that was really a lovely opportunity to see the two of you together and discussing this work. You've been magnificent stewards of your father's work and certainly carried out his wishes that it be available so that many people can see many of these works. But I do note that each of you, Kate and Christopher, have a private collection of his works as well. And I was curious how your preferences overlapped and whether this was an amicable process of dividing them.
Well, I should really get my husband up here to talk about this because he's spoken of it so many times over the years. For those of you who know us, but he actually always says that he has never seen two siblings manage something in such an amicable way. And I had, as the administrator of the estate, a little prelude to this because I had been involved in making the original division with what went to the foundation, and ultimately much came to the National Gallery. But so we used somewhat of the same process, but there was a lot of, oh, maybe you should go first in selecting. Maybe you should go first. So I think we actually, now we look back and say, I wish I'd chosen that one, or I'm going to borrow that painting from you. But at the time, it seemed like an incredibly amicable process. We sat in our basement in Washington with an old-fashioned projector and terrible, color reproductions, although by that time we both knew the works pretty well in person, and managed somehow over, 3 or 4 days to do this.
Yes, but relationship was always primary. We were always checking in to make sure, okay, you comfortable with that pair? You comfortable with that pair? Maybe because we both lost our parents very young, and we were really all the family that we had. Although you had started on a family by that point, but pretty good start, I have to say. So, but we just, and that's always been the case. I mean, we even if I'm taking the lead on something or Kate's taking the lead on something, it's always a cooperative venture. We always make sure that there's no project that either one of us is uncomfortable with. She also used to have a private collection, but I'm always borrowing things from it, so it's mostly on my. That's not true at all. But I do have 2 lovely paintings of hers on my wall right now. So.
Another question.
I'm glad that the previous person asked about your collection, because my question. Oh, hi, I'm over here. Sorry. Hello. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I'm very glad you're over there.
Yeah, I'm glad. This is kind of a lead into my question. I have a million questions I'd like to ask you, but how do you live with the works? I mean, they're your father's paintings, but he's an icon of 20th century American art or world art history. How do you live with these paintings? And this is not like a monetary question, to go back to that previous thought, but like, how many do you own? Do you own like dozens? Like, do you have to store them? Are you rotate them? Just a brief like description of like how you live with this art. And also, I'm curious as to whether, you both went into fields that are not art related. Are you interested more broadly in what's going on in art today? Do you have other paintings by other artists, or is it all about your father's work? Thank you.
That is about 20 questions.
Yes.
Do you want to start?
Well, how do I live with the work? I mean, first of all, I guess, in my case, I was familiar enough growing up with the work that one of the things I try to do when I do hang it is sort of try to create the same ambiance that was in our house growing up, and that's always been very important to me. So one of the things I do, my parents never had any lighting that was focused on the paintings. They always had white ceilings and simply threw light off the ceiling. So every apartment I go to, I sort of try to achieve that effect, or house when we lived in a house. I must say that we recently moved, and I am still struggling with the lighting for the paintings because it doesn't feel quite right to me. It just isn't quite the same ambiance that I'm trying to achieve. The other thing, I think, when I live with the art, I realize that I'm not a museum, and I probably can't provide quite the climate control or the care that a museum can, but I guess I feel, I don't want to say they're mine and I'm willing to take that risk, but I guess I feel it's important enough to me to have them surround me to make the issue of risk a little less important to me. I mean, I even took risks hanging floor-to-ceiling paintings when my children were little, and we had a dog, which I think you've done similar things. So in that sense, I guess I feel like I have some sort of right to do this, but we do rotate and we send things back to storage, which we do have when we feel something's been out too long.
Although I will say, you're sort of talking up, you're right, but you spend most of your life loaning your works, and I feel like both of us, as much as we do, we feel very, very privileged to be able to have works to hang, and that's really thanks to Kate's miraculous triumph over Marlborough Gallery now 40 years ago, but because otherwise it would have been nothing, and very few things in public collections. But we spend much of our collections are often out on loan. I would say probably a little more actively than you do. I use the space where our paintings are because we hold a lot of charity events. People are willing to donate to good causes, to spend some time with the works. But I never know what's going to be up because I never know. I'm being requested all the time for works, and I rarely say no. Any show that has a really a serious purpose and has thought about the safety of the paintings, and there's a context that feels worthwhile, then we loan very actively.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, we're also perhaps willing to take more risks with the paintings than perhaps the average private collector, if you will. So yes, there's a risk every time you lend a painting, but it's a risk, we feel is worthwhile because we'd like those paintings to be, as well as the ones in public collections, we'd like our paintings as well to be seen by the public.
I think we have time for one or two last questions.
Hi. Can you speak about line in his work? Well, either or both of you. So you have the perspective, right, that very deep perspective as an example, where it's very defined, but then so many of his more well-known paintings, the rectangles are very ethereal, which, right, and then now all of a sudden at the end of this, you have rectangles that are very defined edges, and I'm a little surprised that he went back to that. He revisited that. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that, please.
Certainly the sharp juxtaposition of these last black and gray paintings is quite striking, and as much as the white border changes the interaction, the lack of space between the rectangles and the fact that they are more defined. He doesn't really define the edges so much as he allows the edge of the canvas to define. But it's a very, if you've spent any time with these paintings, it was a really bold departure for him, even as it seems like, oh, he's still just painting rectangles. No, it's really quite different. And he was very nervous about it. This is something that's documented. His friend, the artist Robert Motherwell, talks about going to his studio and him bringing out these works and really wanting his opinion. He had a cocktail party actually in his studio where he brought these out to, again, people that he thought would be sensitive viewers. And he really questioned and went back and forth about, it's very clear. I don't know if you can see it at all in this reproduction. At the one on the left, he had that border, and then he painted it out. So it was a huge departure for him. Only thing I will add to about lines, and this is I rarely plug the book, but if you want to see this, you have to buy the book. First of all, that all of his studies for classic Rothkos, and they're not very many, but all of them are black and white. They're coupled with a little bit of like gray wash over them, but they're black and white drawings. They're line drawings. And the other thing is that in his surrealist period, when he's making many, many, many watercolors, there's a tremendous amount of pen and ink drawing. So people who sort of assume that our father couldn't draw, he actually could draw. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, line is obviously one of the primary definers of form, right? So, and of space. So.
One final question. Get in line for the book if you had a question you didn't get answered.
Mark Rothko's painting is timeless, but when he was painting, I believe that you said your father liked Haydn and Mozart. And I wonder if he was listening to those kind of music. And if we could look at Rothko's painting now with the background music of Haydn or Mozart, do you think it will work? Or sometimes he was only looking at one painting, but at the museums it's impossible. There's so many paintings. Mm-hmm. Like I do enjoy museums. It's like I was kid in a buffet, all kinds of food. Mm-hmm. But as I get old, you want to have just one painting and spend more time. So what do you think about those kind of things? More intimacy.
Yeah, I definitely think the intimate is important, and it does become more and more difficult, but it's almost impossible, to catch that single painting. And I think even for us, obviously at home we don't have a great number of paintings hanging, but for me to find that quiet moment to sit down and have that intimate interaction with the painting remains difficult. As far as my father's, and I would almost call it an obsession with Mozart in a way. And Haydn, you're right, to perhaps a slightly less degree, but very important to him. People often ask me why Mozart and Haydn, why classical music, when here is this very modern, at the time, innovative painter. And I've actually recently been thinking of the question of form and my father's obsession with form, and maybe his attraction to classical music was also related to that interest in form. And I still find it a perfect backdrop for the paintings, but maybe because, again, you look back to your childhood, and that's what I grew up with. Mozart always in our house, as well as in the studio. So that was, my Rothko connection growing up as well.
Yes, that sounds like a good acoustic guide, right? Just a little Mozart and Haydn playing.
That's what I was thinking, piping it in. Well, thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. And thank you again to our esteemed guests. Thank you so much, Kate and Christopher, for spending your time with us and sharing such wonderful insights into Rothko's work. So please feel free to join us. There's some light refreshments as well as our book signing just outside this auditorium. So again, have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend.